Springboks haven't just won back-to-back World Cups. They've built a mentality that shows up when they're down to 14 men, when the scoreboard says they're behind, when everyone expects them to crack. Moo-r, it's an Afrikaans word that doesn't translate cleanly into English. Closest thing is controlled aggression, mixed with absolute refusal to back down. It's what made a Springbok captain sacrifice his own career milestone match at halftime during a crucial test. Captain coming off during a significant personal achievement because the team needed a different forward to balance the pack after a red card. That's not normal rugby thinking. That's something else entirely, and here's what nobody's talking about. The All Blacks used to have that fourth quarter dominance where opponents just knew they'd lost before the final whistle. The mental steel that defined generations of players. But watch what happens now when games get tight and physical. South Africa doesn't blink. New Zealand does, just enough that matches against top opponents tilt the wrong way. Former All Black Moo-r Mexted put it bluntly. The team's been buggering around for years and it's tarnished their image. They need to restore the credibility and winning mentality the All Blacks had. Restore what they've been to the rugby world. That's not just about results. It's about the psychological foundation underneath performance. Rassie Erasmus brought in Tony Brown specifically, gave the Springboks perspective on how New Zealand thinks about rugby from the haka right through to individual players and team composition. Erasmus stated publicly that understanding made them play better against the All Blacks. Not because they copied New Zealand's approach, because they understood it well enough to exploit where it had weakened. The gap isn't obvious looking at win-loss records alone. New Zealand still wins most matches. When physical intensity reaches brutal levels and decision-making under extreme pressure determines outcomes. One team operates with systematic fearlessness while the other shows just enough hesitation to lose tight matches. England learned this. Ireland experienced it. Six Nations sides keep discovering that when games descend into warfare where technical advantages disappear, the Springboks thrive in conditions that make everyone else uncomfortable. That's not about being physically tougher. South Africa seeks out the gutter and drags opponents there deliberately. New Zealand still plays beautiful rugby when conditions suit them. But when matches become attritional battles, they look increasingly uncomfortable, because their psychological framework doesn't emphasize that type of rugby as core identity. The difference starts with how each program defines pressure. Erasmus famously told the Springboks that real pressure in South Africa isn't playing rugby. Playing at the highest level isn't pressure, it's privilege. That recontextualization changes how players approach high-stakes moments. Instead of national expectations as burden, they view it as opportunity to create hope for millions. The All Blacks still talk about legacy and responsibility, adding to over a century of tradition. But that carries different weights psychologically. It's about not letting down those who came before rather than lifting up those watching now. But that's not the real reason one team's mental framework proves more resilient in championship moments. What nobody understands is how Erasmus builds this systematically rather than hoping players naturally develop mental toughness. The South African mentality didn't happen accidentally. It's developed through specific approaches he implemented when taking over a team that had suffered devastating losses. Those humiliations became foundation for everything afterward. Erasmus addressed players directly from their first meeting. Paychecks from other obligations and personal brands needed to take back seats. The Springbok comes first on and off the field. Captain Siya Kolisi described how they all bought into that purpose beyond personal goals. They began challenging each other to give their best both on and off the field. That accountability wasn't imposed from above. Players took ownership of what being professional actually means. Now they understand how hard they have to work. Really hard. Players pushing one another rather than coaches having to push players. Compare that to what's happening with the All Blacks under Robertson. Reports suggest widespread internal frustrations within the camp regarding communication, trust, strategy, and selection. Players providing stinging feedback about the regime. Multiple assistant coaches have departed within short periods. Those aren't signs of psychologically cohesive environment where everyone's pulling the same direction. Jeff Wilson, former All Black legend, identified the core issue. There are just too many areas of concern. Areas that were problems months ago remaining unfixed. The job as coaches is to look at where there's an issue and find ways for the team to become educated so they're not making the same mistakes. Problems staying problems rather than getting solved is failure to establish collective ownership where players themselves demand solutions. When Springboks players receive calls at unconventional hours with unconventional requests from Erasmus, they trust the system enough to embrace it without hesitation. Players have been asked to cover unfamiliar positions in World Cup knockout matches. That trust doesn't exist without years of building psychological safety where players believe coaches have their best interests and team success as primary motivations. New Zealand's environment doesn't currently demonstrate that same trust. Robertson confirmed that assistant Scott Hansen effectively operates in the role most would recognize as head coach. That revelation stunned rugby circles in New Zealand. Players seeking explanations about selection are told to speak with assistants rather than Robertson himself. Creates psychological distance between head coach and players that undermines collective mentality required at international level. The Springboks approach adversity with systematic fearlessness. When players receive red cards leaving them with 14 men, captains have come off at halftime during career milestone matches to bring on forwards who could balance team structure. Ireland tried building similar mentality under Andy Farrell. England attempted it under Eddie Jones. Individuals sometimes prioritize self-preservation over collective sacrifice, not because they're selfish, because psychological conditioning hasn't reached the level where that choice becomes automatic. Robertson pitched himself as cultural coach when interviewing for the All Blacks job. Wanted to restore mental edge and winning mentality. You read in British papers the All Blacks have lost their aura, and nobody fears them anymore. That frustration captures what's at stake psychologically. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The South African mentality manifests best in how each team responds to physicality, reaching levels that eliminate technical advantages. South Africa seeks contact out as fuel, thus Erasmus has stated that some opponents take you to the gutter and you have to swim there. His teams don't avoid the gutter, they arrive first and outwork opponents in those exact conditions that everyone else finds uncomfortable. New Zealand still executes good rugby, but when games descend into physical warfare where clean execution becomes secondary to who refuses to break first, they show increasing discomfort. The Springboks view themselves as warriors first who happen to play rugby, rather than rugby players who sometimes need to be physical. That distinction matters psychologically. When senior forwards prepare for matches, they're not thinking about executing skills cleanly. They're preparing for battle, where technical execution happens as byproduct of winning physical and mental contests first. Robertson's challenge is rebuilding that framework in an environment where players have been conditioned differently. His Crusaders' success came from developing young players who bought into his approach from the start. The All Black squad contains veterans formed under different psychological systems, who now need retraining, significantly harder than building culture from scratch. South Africa maintains continuity of psychological approach even as personnel changes. New players entering the system understand immediately what's expected mentally, because they've watched senior players model South African mentality for years. Being selected means accepting the Springbok comes before everything else. The All Blacks lack that continuity currently. Robertson brought his Crusaders coaching team who are still learning at international level. Players aren't certain what the psychological framework is, because it's still being defined. New Zealand rugby reviews have examined communication, trust, strategy, and selection. Those are symptoms. The underlying issue is absence of clear psychological identity that everyone's bought into completely. What makes this particularly challenging for World Rugby is there's no solution to psychological superiority. They can change laws around scrums, breakdowns, substitutions, but they can't legislate against one nation having better mental preparation than competitors. Erasmus uses simulation tools where players control themselves on screen before trying moves in training, building mental connections between strategy and execution that make decision-making automatic under pressure, adding psychological layers through innovations most programs haven't considered. Kolisi explained it simply. Rassie wants to tove as the game evolved. What helped win previous World Cups doesn't necessarily help in the next one. That mindset of constant evolution prevents complacency while maintaining psychological core. The gap isn't insurmountable for New Zealand. Robertson has proven he can build winning cultures at franchise level, but closing it requires time and complete buy-in from players who need to subordinate individual goals to collective purpose. Former players recognize this, restore the credibility and winning mentality that the All Black team has had. To do that, you've got to perform consistently, whether it's home or away. Consistency comes from psychological stability. When mental framework is solid, performance becomes predictable. The Springboks demonstrate this by winning tight matches in hostile environments. The All Blacks show inconsistency because psychological foundation isn't settled yet. That's why one team keeps pulling ahead while the other searches for answers to problems that remain unfixed. The South African mentality isn't just about being tough, it's about having psychological framework so robust that adversity becomes fuel rather than obstacle. And right now, only one team has built that at the level required to dominate international rugby consistently.